Welcome to Between Authors. I am your host, Author Adrian Lopez. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that book or author that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt as a reader. The goal for my podcast is to bring to you those books or authors that may have been the treasure you've been searching for all along. Today on episode 31, I bring to you author Angela Sylvaine. We're going to go over a little bit about who she is, what she's published, maybe what she's working on, and maybe your plans for the future. Welcome to the show, Angela.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm happy to have you here today. Why don't you give a little bit of an introduction to the viewers about, who you are, what you like, stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So I write dark fiction, so horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And I've probably been writing just over 10 years, maybe a little more than 10 years. Kind of got started writing late in life, in my mid 30s. And I have a lot of short fiction out there and poetry, but recently have more been delving into long fiction. So just released my first novel last year and a novella shortly before that. And as far as just a little bit about me, I grew up in North Dakota and I now live in Colorado with my sweetheart and my 3 creepy cats.
So you went from cold to cold, right? You
That's right.
just love the snow.
I like to have seasons, It's good to still have snow in the winter, but I will say Colorado is nowhere near as cold as North Dakota. So it was definitely weather-wise a step up for sure.
That's good. That's definitely good. We're going to talk a little bit in a moment about your book, Frostbite, but I know you mentioned you have a novella and some other like short stories. Is there a way for the readers to find those? Do you have a website for that, or are they somewhere that they could get to?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, my website, angelasylvaine.com, which is just my name, has links to all my short stories. And there's some in there that are free to read. So that's a great place to go if you want to check out my work.
Okay, perfectly. And I just want to remind the viewers that I will leave all of Angela's links down below in the description on this video. So you'll be able to find her website, the links to her books, socials, whatever one she wants to focus on. So everything will be down below in this video. Why don't you give the viewers a little bit of a background in terms of what your influences are, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be other authors or books, anything creatively that influences you.
Sure. So I think one of my first influences was probably movies. So though I grew up pretty poor in North Dakota, one thing we always made sure we had enough money for was television. So we always had HBO. I always had access to that kind of entertainment. And being a kid in the 80s and 90s, really that meant a lot of like B movies. We didn't have a lot of television choices back then. And so you just kind of watched what was on. And I think that really has influenced some of the way I write as well. So, I was watching things like Critters, slashers like Friday the 13th and Halloween, Gremlins, those kind of things were definitely very much part of what kind of influenced me when I was younger. But then at the same time, I also would take my babysitting money and buy books at the thrift store for a quarter. So a lot of those books, as you can probably imagine, were Stephen King. There's a lot of Stephen King books at the thrift store, or at least there was at mine. So I started reading Stephen King and Dean Koontz and those kind of things from a pretty young age, like in junior high. So I think those were probably the main influences that have been cooking in my brain.
Yeah. So is horror a big part of you in terms of movies and literature and everything just in general?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely my favorite genre. Even though I dabble in science fiction and fantasy, there's pretty much always a horror element. And I didn't always write horror. When I first started out, I wrote more young adult paranormal romance. That was kind of what was popular at that time.
Yeah.
And also what I was reading. I've always really loved young adult books, but there weren't a lot of young adult horror books. So delving a little bit into paranormal things was sort of the closest you could get to horror, 10, 15 years ago, I think, in the young adult space. So when I first started writing, I wrote more young adult with like a little bit of romance, but my stories kept getting darker. And it just was like my natural instincts were kicking in. And eventually I realized horror was sort of like my happy place,
Yeah.
ironically.
No, I completely understand. Horror is huge for me as well. My wife and I love horror just in general. I'm older than you, so I have the background of the golden era with Universal monsters, and then Hammer, in the 70s on their versions, and then basically all the horror going forward. So I completely understand that. I mean,
I love those
it's my
eras.
love as well. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's great. So why don't let's talk about your book, Frostbite. So why don't you give the viewers a little bit of an idea about what the book's about, or a little synopsis, however you want to do that.
Sure. So it's a 90s sci-fi horror comedy. So lots of genres there. And if I had to compare it to something, it would be kind of like Gremlins meets Invasion of the Body Snatchers meets Fargo. And the actual plot is about a small town in North Dakota that gets hit by a meteor and it infects the hibernating prairie dogs with alien worms. And there's the main character, Raylene, kind of witnesses this meteor land and is one of the first people to realize something is a little bit off. It's the middle of winter, it's very cold, and these prairie dogs essentially rise from their hibernation, which is not normal in North Dakota. And she and her best friend, Nate, essentially have to figure out how to save their town while also dealing with their own personal issues. Like she's caring for her mother who has dementia. And there's also a doomsday cult that's trying to get in their way that thinks the meteor is a sign of the apocalypse, which they're excited about. So they're juggling a lot, trying to save their town and stop these aliens from spreading.
Yeah, that's I love the three mixtures that you have for that with Fargo, you said, and
Yeah.
Invasion of the Body Snatcher. I mean, that's a perfect little mixture to kind of explain that storyline. It just sounds great. I haven't had a chance to read it as of yet, but I do have it on my to read.
Awesome.
My problem is just timing. I never have enough time to be able to do everything.
You don't have to explain my TBR. Someday it's
Yeah.
going to fall over and crush me. That's probably how I'm going to die.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy sometimes all the stuff as indie authors that you got to kind of do to keep this stuff going. But
I know.
personally, I love it. Right, I love being busy like this and doing this.
Me too.
So in your book, do you have a favorite scene in the book? It could be the actual scene. It could be how the scene came about.
Sure. Yeah. So my favorite scene is probably, I remember actually my editor for my book was the first scene they mentioned to me as well, that they loved it. They thought it was perfect from the first time they read it. And it really encapsulates everything I like about the book. So it's about, so Raylene, the main character, works at a gas station and she's just recently graduated high school. She ends up running into a gal named Brooke, who was kind of her first love in high school and who is not very nice. She's kind of a bully. And Brooke is home for the holidays and sort of mocking Raylene for working at the gas station and not being able to make it off to college. And she ends up being the first character that is attacked by prairie dogs. So basically, Raylene is watching from the gas station while this ski bunny essentially gets attacked by rabid prairie dogs. And she's fighting them off. And Raylene goes out there to try and help her with a baseball bat. She also ends up using a Santa, cardboard cutout Santa, because it takes place around Christmas, like an advertisement, as a shield. Yeah. So it's like a bat and a shield trying to fight off these rabid prairie dogs. So it's very action-packed and just one of those scenes I think that's like fun to picture in your mind and was really fun to write.
That sounds great.
And who doesn't want their childhood bully to get attacked by like rabid animals, you know?
Yeah. Just the image of the cardboard Santa cutout too as your shield is just great. On the opposite side of that, did you have a hard scene? Something maybe that was just difficult to get together, or maybe a scene that
Mhm.
pulled off of an old memory or emotion that just was difficult to get on the page?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two that come to mind. One of them is a little spoilery, so I'll only mention it very briefly.
Yeah.
But there was a particularly impactful emotional scene. So even though this is horror comedy, I wanted to also really bring like true characters into it and real emotion. And there's a scene that I wrote that I cried while I was writing it because I had to do something pretty brutal that was sad.
Yeah.
And it's also the scene that I most often hear from readers about. They will text me with the page number, message me with the page number and say, "How dare you do this to me?" So that one was hard to write, but I can't really say what it was about. The
Yeah.
other one that comes to my mind is, since this is sort of an action-packed movie, there's kind of a big climax with there's like a chase scene and tons of animals and people, infected animals, infected people. So it was a lot of choreography, to try to
Hmm.
figure out how to show the reader exactly what was happening with all these moving parts, but also not slow down the pace because it needed to move forward quickly and be exciting while also clear. So that was a challenge. I had to work through that one a few times before I got it right.
Yeah. That's all. I can imagine that when you have that many moving parts, sometimes that is kind of difficult to just keep it on track as you're trying to get through it. In terms of the book in general, I know because you said it takes place during the 90s. I mean, basically, we went through the 90s, so a lot of that
Yeah.
is maybe experiences or memories. But did you do any specific research for this book?
Yeah, I did. You're right that I had a lot of personal experience because I'm similar in age to the characters and everything. But also, you don't really know how accurate your memory is. And there's a lot of cultural sort of touch points in the book. So I specifically include music and movies and fads and foods and current events. Those all thread through the book. So it's very 90s. So I had to do a lot of fact checking on dates and, was this song actually out yet at the time this is taking place? Those kind of things.
Hmm.
And then the other thing I did a lot of research on, a couple things, were prairie dogs because there are infected prairie dogs in it. So I had to learn a lot about prairie dogs and how they behave and how they communicate and everything. And then the other thing, which was probably the most funny, was there's a next door neighbor in the book named Calvin, who's kind of a silly character, like a little wacky, but with a good heart. And he's very into taxidermy. So he has a lot of taxidermied animals around his house, including prairie dogs. So I had to go down a couple rabbit holes of taxidermy, which wasn't my favorite thing to learn about.
Yeah.
I don't really like taxidermy myself, but I had to make it true to his character so I would know what I was talking about.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy. I've mentioned it every once in a while on the podcast, and the reason I always ask that question is, research really is. I always consider it kind of like the seasoning or the condiment, right, for a meal, and it's almost guaranteed that somebody will catch you if you don't understand what you're speaking about in taxidermy, right? You could have just kind of went around on the edges of it, and there's going to be somebody reading and just says, "Wait a minute, that's not how it works. You have to
Right,
do this, this, and this, and this," and that sometimes takes them out of the story, right? And
yes, that's
you
right.
want that connection with the reader to be able to feel and the emotions, the thoughts that you were having as you're writing through it. And it's important. It's important, even if it's something just very minimal or trivial that you want to look up. But
Yep.
there will be somebody that will know it.
There is.
That just says,
Yes.
"Wait a minute,
If
this
you
is
do it
not
wrong,
this."
yeah, I think that is so true. And thank goodness we have the internet. Like, how did writers doing research before the internet was a heck of a lot harder. They had to like look up minutia in books, which was nowhere near as fast. But to your point, I can even remember looking up things as small as a type of trailer hitch that would be on a truck. There's there's a scene where they have to hook something to a truck, and I I wanted to make sure I got that hitch part right, because if I didn't, someone might notice and it's going to take them out of the story, even though it's a really small thing. So, yep, I think you're right on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always, it's something that you don't really think about sometimes, but it is very, very important whenever you're writing something. I mean, it's probably a little more in terms of sci-fi and fantasy, even though you have a lot more leadway in there. But again, there's so many fans that have just loved it forever that you can't try to just get around the edge sometimes with some of these things.
No, you're exactly right.
Um, so this one's already published and out for everybody to be able to get. Are you currently working on a book or a story, a current project?
Yeah, I have a couple things going. So I am writing a sequel to Frostbite, which I'm in the progress with right now. That will be coming out roughly March of 2025. So that's very exciting. It'll still take place in North Dakota, but we're also going on a road trip for spring break. So, in the late 90s, like MTV Spring Break was a very 90s thing. So I'm going to dabble a little bit with that, which I think is going to be fun. And then I also am just putting finishing touches on my first short story collection. So that will come out in May of 2024, and it's called The Dead Spot: Stories of Lost Girls. So it's a collection of stories about women and girls battling monsters, obsession, heartbreak, and just like the darkness in the world around them. So that'll come out in May. And then also later this year, I have a re-release of my novella Chopping Spree. So I previously wrote a novella for the Rewind or Die series through Unnerving Press, which is a really great series. If people haven't had a chance to check it out, it's wonderful.
Okay.
And my current publisher, Dark Matter, offered me the opportunity to expand it and re-release it with a new cover. So it's kind of like an uncut version of Chopping Spree, and that I'm putting the finishing touches on that as well, and that will come out probably in September of 2024.
That sounds great. I love the fact that you're doing a short story horror collection. I have one of those I want to do this year as well. Probably keeping it to 4 short stories. Not I don't really have what's a little different. I don't really have a set theme. They're 4 completely different horror short stories, but one of them is my take on La Llorona storyline, but a more modern take of it. But yeah, I love that you're doing that as well. That's great. I mean, it's something I
I
really
love
wanted to
reading
do.
short story collections. It's really one of my favorite things as a reader,
Mhm.
because you can pick it up and put it down and read individual stories. It's a great way to get to know an author. And that's the other nice part about it. Like you said, you don't necessarily have to have a theme. You
Yeah.
can, but there's so much flexibility and so many great options for collections and things. So yeah, I love those as a reader. So I'm really excited to put one out too.
Yeah, that sounds great. Um, so those are what you have currently in the work, right, Joe? You have your sequel, you have the short story collection, then you have the re-release, right? The director's cut
Yeah.
of your previous
Yeah.
short story or novella. Um, do you have any goals as a writer? Something maybe that is it another genre maybe you want to attack at some point, or some storylines, or again maybe some of your old short stories that you really at the more you thought about, you like, this could have been a much bigger story, things that you have planned or you would like to do in the future.
Oh, for sure. I think I have goals in a couple of ways. As you know, as a writer, you don't run out of ideas. That's for sure. So I definitely have a backlog of books I want to write. I want to write a novella that I've already started, but I had to kind of put it aside because I have deadlines, for other things. That's a roller derby to the death, post-apocalyptic roller derby story. I would love to finish that. And I have another novel idea as well that I want to set in the same North Dakota town that Frostbite is in. So I would love to set some more stories in this town that I've built and make it kind of like a Castle Rock or something like that, right?
Hmm.
Where I can use that town and essentially make it a place that's just a little off and for some reason, weird stuff keeps happening there, or horrible stuff keeps happening there, is kind of what I'm thinking. So I'd love to write more in the town of Demise, North Dakota. And then, so those are kind of the things I'm excited to work on writing wise. I think as far as goals, just as an author, I definitely do think of it as a job for myself. I have a day job too, but I treat it as a job. And so as far as goals, I really like working with an independent press, which is what I do now. But I probably will try my hand again at trying to get traditionally published at some point. When I think I'm ready for that and I have another book ready that seems like it maybe is a good possibility. Just because, I'd love someday to be carried more widely in bookstores everywhere and things like that, which can be hard for an indie author. Certainly a lot of local bookstores have been super supportive, and even nationally, little, independent bookstores have been super supportive, but there is something really satisfying about seeing your book on the shelf no matter where you go.
Yeah.
So that's probably my big dream goal, is to be successful enough to be able to walk into just about any bookstore and see my book.
I mean, that's probably the goal for a lot of different authors, to really have. It's it's for anybody getting into it, it's very difficult to explain the indie author side of it, right? Because you really do have to do everything, yourself, right? Marketing, just about everything. And it's difficult, right? It's difficult. And that's why I do this podcast. That's why I do what I do on Twitter and TikTok to try to share other authors, is that, you need that help. You need that community to try to get you out there. And hopefully there's a couple readers that, kind of see you that maybe weren't seeing you before and say, oh, this is a new one. And, that's really what you have to do. That community is what kind of gets you out there and hopefully gives you that new audience, right? That audience that hasn't seen you before. Try to spread that out.
And I think indie authors, in my mind, I kind of divided into 3 groups for people that aren't familiar with it. I think of self-published authors who do 100% of the work themselves, which I don't think I could do. That's a huge job. And I give self-published authors a lot of credit. They're extremely smart and talented and do a lot of things I don't think I'd be able to do. And then you have independently published authors, which are with maybe a smaller press, and those can vary in size. But generally, with that kind of situation, you're going to have someone that's going to help you get a nice cover and format your book and get it into distributors like Ingram and get you an ISBN and all that other stuff. But you're still going to, like you said, have to do the majority of the marketing yourself. Like maybe depending on the publisher, they're going to do a few things here and there. But largely it's up to you to do all of that. And then in traditional publishing, maybe you actually have like a marketing department and a publicist and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you're completely right. While I love working with an independent publisher, and I've had great experiences working with them on both short works and my novel, you have to really set aside not writing time, but, marketing time. Essentially almost just as much as you write. So you've probably had that same experience.
Yeah. I mean, I'm doing everything self, published for me. So you're just doing everything, with whatever little free time you do have to get it out there and get it going. One of the questions I did want to ask you, which is a little different than, again, what I usually ask, is I know your short stories are female led, and so is Frostbite. And I do want to ask you if that, going forward, is all your main characters going to be female? And the reason I do ask that is because I come from a family that is primarily female. I have all sisters, and they had all nieces, right? So it's all female. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the strong female characters. On Twitter, I always do, my shout outs are always my sister shout outs for all the other female accounts for that reason, right? It's just
Yeah.
something I like to do. And, on some of my stories of my children's, my main children's book is the one dedicated to the memory of my daughter, but I have other children's stories that I'm going to do that are outside of that. And I plan on all of those always being a female lead character, right? So it's the younger sister that's the hero in the book, or it's the sister rather than the brother having to do it or anything on that side. Um, so is that a plan for you going forward? Is your main character is always going to be female led?
Yeah, I think that's my instinct for sure. Who knows, maybe someday I'll do something different. But I think probably of all the short stories I have out there, I think I've got over probably 50 publications in various anthologies and magazines and podcasts. I think only one has a has a main character that is not female.
Mhm.
So I don't know that I give it conscious thought. That's just my instinct to write from that perspective. Um, and kind of like you were saying, I think it's good to do that. Certainly for women and girls, we don't always get to see ourselves reflected as much
Yeah.
generally, right? Even if you look at just stuff like, some of the uproar around Marvel movies and changing, you have some like kind of gender discussion around that.
Yeah.
And why do we have to also have female superheroes? Well, the whole reason we do is because that discussion, right? You
Mm.
want people to be able to see themselves
Yeah.
in any kind of story. In that example, it's a hero, but I think more like in what I write, it's tough situations and it doesn't always have a happy ending, but they always have some fortitude and agency. So even when things don't go right, they fight back, they do their best given the situation that they're in. And I think that helps anyone kind of think about, well, maybe I can persevere in a hard situation too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other things, probably very that kind of correlates to this, is probably the love of horror that both of you and I have, because they are the ones that really do the best job with female main characters, right? The female hero
Yeah,
on the slasher films,
totally.
Ripley and Alien, Sarah Connor for Terminator. You have those stronger female characters, and that's the one genre that's always kind of taken the lead on that
Yeah,
side of it.
you're exactly right. When you think about that final girl, it doesn't always have to be a girl. It can be a guy too, but often it's a girl. And I think you're right. The genre kind of owned that first. And part of maybe why it works is because using a character that is against heavier odds makes the win more satisfying, right? And
Yeah.
also I think for the reader gives you a little more hope. So if you had like a big dude battling Jason, he's probably going to have a better chance,
Yeah.
than like a little gal. So when that girl wins, it's like an even more satisfying win that they were able to fight back against such odds, and maybe if they can win, maybe the rest of us can when we don't feel so big either.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, in terms of your writing style, do you feel your writing style's been the same? I always like to call it the voice, right? Your voice as an author. Do you feel it's been the same, or have you noticed it change over the years, or change maybe from your short stories going in now to your first novel? Did you see a change, or is your voice your voice?
I think it has changed over time, but it's probably more a matter of finding your voice. So,
Mhm.
like, I think particularly for me, starting writing a little bit later, in my mind, I wanted to write more literary, right? And I know other writers sometimes feel this way too, where you're kind of holding up this standard of what good writing is. And so at one point I was, for example, thinking of going to get my MFA, which nothing wrong with getting your MFA. If I had thought of it sooner, I probably would have done it. But you don't really need that.
Yeah.
And and the reason I personally was holding that up is because I thought, well, to be a good writer, I need to really understand everything about it and be qualified and write in a literary way. But that's not actually really my style, probably because I grew up watching horror movies and things. My style is actually way more like writing scripts. So that's kind of what happened with Frostbite is I've had people tell me, and I think this is true, it reads like watching a movie. It's very fast paced. It's not
Yeah.
flowery. It doesn't have a ton of extra words. And that's kind of my style. I think is actually very simple and like vivid as far as what you see in your mind. Lots of dialogue and action. And it just took me a while, I think, to kind of realize that was my natural voice and to accept that I don't have to write like someone else. I can just write what's natural to me.
Yeah. Again, it might be the horror background, right? Because I kind of approach it the same way. Is that as I'm writing, it's like I'm watching the movie also, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm it's almost like I'm dictating the movie I'm watching in my head. I actually see the scenes and stuff like that. So I think it goes back to all those hours and hours and hours of those movies. And again, when you think about it, when you think about the B movies, right, the horror classics that are great movies, but they're not great movies, right? But they give you everything you want, right? You're thoroughly entertained, scared, right? The jumps, the thrills, the suspense, and is it the literary work of like watching Schindler's List or any of those? No, but you absolutely love that movie, and that's the individual thing that connects with readers. Not every reader wants to read War and Peace or
That's right.
Great Gatsby or any of those books.
Yeah.
They sometimes just want that fun, that getaway. Like you're just sometimes I just want to watch, right, a Marvel movie, a sci-fi, Star Wars or whatever. I don't need necessarily the whole background. And that's really why I asked you the question, because again, I probably harping it way too much in this podcast, but I always like to point out the fact of that voice, right? And like you said,
Mm-hmm.
you found your voice, and that's something I always try to push on here, especially for the younger writers, is don't get caught in a specific genre or a specific style of an author you loved or something, because that's not your voice, right? Find,
Mm-hmm.
you can use all those, you use all that foundation from everything you loved and read and just want to kind of get that kind of thing. But if you try to do it in that style or emulate it, it's not your voice, and the readers will not feel it, right? Because it's not really from you. And that's really why I asked that, because at some point, like you said, you found it. You went and said, no, this is how I want to approach it. This is
Mm-hmm.
how I want to do it. And that's you, right? That's you as an
Right.
author. And like you said, they're telling you the page and saying, look, what happened here on this page? Because they felt that from you. It came from
Yeah.
you, right? Those emotions, that connection.
Yep. And when you're genuine, I think, and also I think when you're having fun doing what you do, I think the reader can tell.
Yeah.
If it's a chore and it's not kind of coming natural to you, it's not normally probably going to resonate as well as when,
They're going to feel that as well, right? They're
yeah,
going to feel that it's not comfortable. It's not
yeah,
flowing like it would if you're really enjoying it.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's an excellent point that I always like to kind of put out there, is that you're not going to find it right away, right? And for younger authors, not to be hard on themselves right away. Almost anything you do in life takes practice, right? You're just going to get better at it.
Yeah.
So, you
And
know,
even still now, like I feel like I'm relatively confident in my skills as a writer. Not that there isn't always more you can learn and do
yeah,
better, but I'm a relatively confident in my skills. But I still write crappy things, right? Like when I write a first draft, it's usually not great
yeah,
because that's just how it goes. I mean, you know, Like the first draft, the whole point is to just get the ideas on the page, and
Yeah.
then you come through and fix them. So yeah, I don't know that ever. Probably there are authors out there who their first draft is great, but I'm certainly not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there's some that just, it happens, right? Like in music, you have one hit wonders that came out with something that everybody loves, and the rest of the album, you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
Who wrote the rest of these things? But it happens, right? It does happen. And sometimes those are the ones that struggle to get that, that lightning back, that little magic, that hit. But yeah, it's an interesting thing that it just gets better. It gets better over time. Not to be so hard on yourself at the beginning, and expect it to be right, that bestseller, that one that everybody catches on to and just absolutely loves. It's just the odds are against it. That's going to happen.
That's right.
First one.
You, at least if you're having fun and you like it, start there.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Most of us just love this, right? We love writing. We love the stories, and that's the beauty of it, right? You're doing something you love. If you somehow can make money out of it and make it your full time, that's just even better. But
Yep.
the fact that you're doing something you love is just what makes it amazing.
Agreed.
Um, Another question for you. So are you, you know, outside of the plotter versus pantser kind of thing, do you find yourself changing the story? And like we talked about from your first draft through, do you find yourself really changing the story a lot, or do you find yourself kind of, for the most part, sticking with the original structure of it? Or does it sometimes just go on its own in a different direction?
Oh, there definitely are times when it goes on its own in a different direction. Even like I'm working on the sequel to Frostbite now. And it's funny as a writer where sometimes people will just show up, right? Like I'm writing a scene. And so, for example, they're going to spring break and they need to go to a travel agency to book their trip because it's the 90s and they don't know what they're doing. They've never gone anywhere anymore. They've never traveled. So they go to a travel agency, and the character who died in book one, Brooke, who I mentioned, one of the characters who died, her mom is the travel agent. But I didn't plan that ahead. They just walked in the door, and I was like, my fingers were like, obviously it would be Brooke's mom who works here because that's going to make sense to bring her back in, and it's going to bring some emotional resonance with these characters. And it just it kind of like just naturally happened. It's like my mind put it out there before I even consciously realized it. Yeah. Which I think is the most fun part about writing stories. And I think that happens in revisions too. I'll go through revisions and just have like a light bulb moment, like, oh, obviously this is what should happen here, and it would make total sense with the theme of the story. So I just think those are like actually the most satisfying moments when you're writing, when everything just clicks together and this sort of perfect solution presents itself. But if you tie yourself down to following your outline or really sticking with your draft, those little inspirations aren't always going to happen, I don't think.
Yeah. And it's always, I mean, I won't say always, well, yeah, it is actually always better, right? The story is almost always better when you do these and take it sometimes off of that, because again, I could be completely wrong, but I have, I kind of really feel that writer's block is when you're too structured, right? And you're really trying to make that story fit rather than just letting it go where it wants to go. Mm-hmm. And I feel that that's sometimes when you hit those blocks, right? When you hit that thing, because you're doing the square thing in the round hole and trying to get it to fit, and it's not going to, right? Because it's somehow something's kind of altered along the way. And it's just amazing. My end of my werewolf book completely changed from originally where I wanted it to go, and it's better, right? It's so much better than originally I thought, and it went its own direction. But it's amazing how how much that happens, right? And
Mhm.
it goes back to that thing. Don't hold yourself to such strict, rules or boundaries when you're doing this, and just have fun with it. Just have fun and let it
That's
go.
right. Totally. I think you're exactly right. That's when the most fun stuff happens, is when you're kind of just like letting whatever come out, and not putting restrictions on yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing, again, I've probably mentioned this several times in this podcast, but it surprises me how much it makes sense the more I think about it. But it really reminds me of everyday life in terms of a storyline, right? In the storyline, you have, like you said, a character that comes in that you weren't expecting, and in your storyline, your characters have experiences, challenges, obstacles that they come in contact with, and they either grow from that experience, right, or they fall into the same you know thing again where they make the same mistakes. But just like in life, it changes kind of your direction, right?
Yeah.
You either have a growth from it, and that's why I really sometimes go back to that, not holding yourself to that structure, because your characters are having experiences and growth and challenges that they make that life decision from, and it's not always going to have the same outcome that you originally thought of when you kind of thought of this character. And that's why it's so important sometimes to just let it organically grow
Yeah.
as you're writing it, right? And just kind of let it go through.
I think that too makes more genuine characters that are like real people, right? They're not just cardboard cutouts sort of going through the emotions.
Hmm.
Um, if you let them kind of react to the world around them and trigger them in certain ways, kind of hit on whatever their weaknesses are or insecurities or fears, then kind of let them react. I think it's easier to build someone who seems real and that
Yeah,
readers are going to really resonate with.
yeah, absolutely. Um, I really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed kind of I really like your thought process of having that town kind of the center of some of your stories. I think that's a great idea. Um,
Thank you.
I really do. And again, it's something I absolutely love. Is when other authors, movies, whatever, is when they do stuff that you don't normally see, right? Something unique like that. I appreciate that, right? Because
Yeah.
again, for horror lovers like we are, there's far too many sometimes just the same template, right? And you're like, oh, you know what's going to happen. You still love it because it's crazy, right? It's 90
Yeah.
minutes of craziness. But sometimes you're like, I wish they would have really done something different. And when you find that, right, that's just what makes it so much better. It's just coming out from that little different change from a different angle. And I always appreciate that
Yep.
when
Put your
I do
own
see
twist
that or
on
hear
it.
about it. Yeah.
For sure. And I think kind of your own genuine interpretation, right? Bringing your own experiences, your culture, all that stuff to make it unique to your voice, not, just a cookie cutter like what everyone else has done. That's when stories really work for sure.
Yeah. Great. I'm really looking forward. I am looking forward actually to reading your book. But just
Thanks.
looking forward, especially to your short story collection coming out.
Great.
Definitely want to check that one out as well. Again, I want to remind the viewers that I will leave all the links below for Angela's website, for her book, for socials, whatever else she wants to share, for you guys to be able to find her work. And again, if you enjoyed the thing, please leave a comment for either Angela or myself. If you have any questions, about any of the stuff, or just to let us know how you enjoyed the episode and conversation. And definitely don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification so you don't miss all these amazing, talented authors that are coming up. But thank you, Angela, for coming on. I really, really did enjoy this.
Thank you. I had a great time chatting. And thank you for everything you do to support other authors as well. I always just have a great time interacting with you, and you're such a genuine person. We need people like you in our writing community. It makes things, writing can be hard and
Yeah,
lonely.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
it's always nice when you have genuine people who are kind of looking out for each other.
Yeah, I mean, I love doing it. I've written since I was a kid, but kind of like you, I started even later. I really started last year in terms
Oh,
of doing this, you know, professionally, I guess you would call it,
mhm.
right? Or doing this whole publishing thing. And I'm in my 50s on that side. So I started much, much later on that side. But I had some bigger authors kind of support me early on by
Mhm.
sharing my posts and giving me support. Sometimes I had some questions. They very freely offered it and offered advice, and I wanted to do the same, right? I just said, because really in this community, the writing community, we know how hard this is, right? We know how much we have to do. We know how much marketing on ourselves. We know the struggle, right? We all have, or most of us have, the day job, right? And this is your second job, and it's really a full-time job because there's so much to do involved with it, right? With your socials, marketing, all the stuff you have to do, your own, read throughs, your own editing before you give it to the actual editor, figuring out your covers and everything. But yeah, I understand the struggle, and I understand, that a lot of people probably sometimes second guess themselves or doubt themselves. Um, I'm lucky enough where I just don't, right? I've always had a confidence in me, whether it's warranted. I'm not saying I'm great at anything, but I've always had a confidence in, like, look, I'm putting the effort, I'm doing everything I need to do to learn it, and putting that foot forward. So I understand not everybody has that, and I want to let them know that there is somebody there to support them and know that they're doing a great job, right? That they are, just keep with it. Don't give up, and
Yeah.
just keep with it, right? Just keep going.
Yep. I love it.
Yeah. But thank you again, Angela, for coming on, and thank you, viewers, for watching. Goodbye.